In 1945, 9,300 weapons crossed 6,000 miles of ocean without engines, without pilots, without fuel, made entirely of paper and glue, and one of them nearly stopped the atomic bomb. Paper shouldn't survive 3 days in a Pacific storm. Balloons shouldn't maintain altitude for 70 hours straight. High school students shouldn't be building intercontinental weapons. Yet all of this happened, and the American government censored everything for 6 months. Here's what was at stake. If these paper balloons had succeeded, thousands of square miles of forests would have burned, panic would have spread across the West Coast, and the Manhattan Project could have been exposed or destroyed. One balloon actually knocked out power to the Hanford Plutonium facility for 3 days, the same plutonium that later detonated over Nagasaki. If that power outage had lasted longer, if those reactors had been permanently damaged, if the timing had been slightly different, World War II might have ended very differently. Nobody knew about any of this. Not the American public, not most military commanders, and most critically, not the Japanese themselves. They launched 9,000 balloons into the Pacific jet stream, thinking they were conducting psychological warfare. But what they actually created was the world's first intercontinental weapon system, predating ICBMs by 12 years. April 1942, American B-25 bombers strike Tokyo in the Doolittle raid, humiliating the Japanese military by proving their homeland is vulnerable. The Imperial Army is desperate for revenge, but they have a problem. No aircraft can reach the American mainland from Japan. The distance is impossible. Fuel requirements are absurd. Suicide missions in one-way planes get discussed and dismissed. Then someone remembers an obscure meteorologist who discovered something 20 years earlier. Something that flows 30,000 feet above the Pacific at 200 miles per hour. Something invisible. Something powerful enough to carry weapons across an entire ocean. The story starts with Wasaburo Oishi, a meteorologist who made one of the most important discoveries in atmospheric science and then published it in Esperanto. Yes, Esperanto, the artificial language almost nobody spoke. Between 1923 and 1925, Oishi launched nearly 1,300 weather balloons from his observatory near Mount Fuji, noticing something impossible. At certain altitudes, winter winds didn't just blow east, they screamed east at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, sometimes 200. He documented this phenomenon meticulously, wrote 19 reports totaling 1,246 pages, and published every single one in Esperanto because he believed in international scientific cooperation. The international scientific community ignored him completely. But here's the insane part. The Japanese military didn't. After the Doolittle raid, Imperial Army officials remembered Oishi's research and consulted meteorologists who extrapolated his data across the entire Pacific, calculating that a balloon released in winter could reach North America in 30 to 100 hours. The concept was assigned to the 9th Technical Research Institute at Noborito with a mission: create a balloon weapon system that could deliver incendiary bombs to American forests, starting massive wildfires that would force the United States to divert resources from the Pacific theater. The first tests were catastrophic failures. Early prototypes used rubberized silk, but wartime shortages killed that immediately. Balloons burst at high altitude, crashed into the ocean, drifted off course and landed in Siberia. The engineering challenges were staggering. How do you keep a balloon aloft for 70 hours when hydrogen expands during the day and contracts at night? How do you prevent it from rising too high and bursting? How do you make it descend at exactly the right moment to drop bombs? How do you do all of this with zero human control, just physics and chemistry? The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source: traditional Japanese papermaking. Engineers discovered that washi paper made from kozo tree fibers had tensile strength comparable to fabric. And when laminated in 5 layers using konnyaku paste made from Japanese potatoes, it created a material that was simultaneously lightweight, durable, and gas-tight. Each balloon required about 600 individual pieces of paper meticulously cut and glued together with exact precision. The Japanese military conscripted high school girls to assemble these balloons in 7 converted factories around Tokyo. Teenagers working 12 hours a day, pasting pieces together, told only that it was a secret weapon, but never explained what they were actually building. 10,000 balloons was the target. Each measured 33 feet in diameter when fully inflated, with 19,000 cubic feet of hydrogen total weight when loaded approximately 1,000 pounds. Compare that to a modern weather balloon at 6 feet diameter and maybe 20 pounds. The Fugo balloons were engineering marvels disguised as paper toys. Suspended beneath each balloon was an aluminum chandelier ring holding 32 sandbags, 3 redundant aneroid barometers, altimeters calibrated for different trigger heights, blowout plugs connected to each sandbag, 4 or 5 bombs, and a self-destruct mechanism. Here's how it worked. After launch, a 1-hour fuse activated the altitude control system. If the balloon descended below 25,000 feet, barometric pressure triggered a small explosive charge that severed one sandbag, dropping it into the ocean, and the lightened balloon climbed back into the jet stream automatically, repeatedly, for up to 3 days. When the balloon ascended too high above 38,000 feet where it risked bursting, a relief valve opened automatically, venting hydrogen until altitude decreased. No radio, no GPS, no pilot, just physics. The cost was roughly 400 yen per balloon, approximately $100 in 1944 currency, equivalent to maybe $1,700 today. Compare that to a B-29 bomber at $639,000. Then, roughly 10 million today, Japan could launch 15 balloon bombs for the cost of a single bullet from a conventional aircraft. Production accelerated through late 1944, with 3 launching sites selected on Honshu's eastern coast, each capable of launching 200 to 300 balloons per day with good weather. Each launch required exactly 30 personnel and took between 30 minutes and 1 hour. November 3rd, 1944, the 92nd birthday of Emperor Meiji, the Japanese military chooses this date deliberately for the first launch. A single unarmed test balloon rides the jet stream east. 68 hours later, U.S. Navy patrol ships spotted something floating off San Pedro, California. 66 miles from Los Angeles, sailors hauled it aboard. A massive deflated paper sphere with Japanese markings and a rising sun painted on top. They had absolutely no idea what they were looking at. December 6th, 1944. Thermopolis, Wyoming, 800 miles inland from the Pacific coast. Witnesses reported a bright red flash in the sky, a whistling noise, then an explosion, and the next day, investigators found fragments of a 33-pound Japanese anti-personnel bomb in a snowy field. How did a Japanese weapon travel 800 miles inland, from where submarines can't operate that far from shore? Aircraft couldn't possibly fly that distance undetected. The fragments were recent, still warm from the explosion. American military intelligence entered panic mode. Between December 1944 and April 1945, more balloons appeared everywhere: Montana, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, California, Nebraska, Michigan, even Texas and Kansas. One landed 10 miles from Detroit. Another appeared near Omaha. The geographic spread made no sense. These weren't targeted strikes. They were random scatter patterns. The military's first theories were insane. Were German POWs in camps building them? Were Japanese-American internees secretly constructing weapons? Were submarines surfacing just offshore to launch them? Then someone examined the balloons more carefully and found sand in the ballast bags. Sand that clearly wasn't from North America or Hawaii. Forensic geology saved the day. The U.S. Geological Survey analyzed the sand and found microscopic marine fossils unique to coastal Japan. Analysts narrowed it down to 2 possible beaches east of Tokyo, and American B-29 bombers received new targeting coordinates. hydrogen production plants on Honshu. Of 9,300 launched, experts estimate maybe 1,000 crossed the Pacific. Only about 300 were actually recovered or documented. The rest either crashed into the ocean, exploded mid-flight, or landed in remote wilderness areas where they remain undiscovered to this day. Balloons kept appearing for decades after the war ended. One was found in Canada in 2014, still functional, still containing explosives, 69 years after launch. The intended strategic effect, massive forest fires, completely failed because winter launch dates meant forests were snow-covered or too damp to ignite. Weather patterns in 1945 were unusually wet, with some areas receiving 4 to 10 inches more precipitation than typical years. The few fires that did start were small grass fires that extinguished quickly. But 3 incidents came terrifyingly close to success. March 10, 1945, 4 balloons detected over Washington state in a single day. One descended near Toppenish and collided with high-tension power lines on the Bonneville Power Administration grid, causing complete power loss across central Washington. The largest consumer of electricity on that grid was Hanford Engineer Works, the Manhattan Project's plutonium production facility. Backup systems kicked in within seconds, preventing a complete reactor shutdown. But plutonium production stopped cold for 3 days. 3 days of delays in producing the material that would eventually detonate over Nagasaki. Nobody in Japan knew this happened because the American media blackout was absolute. January 4th, 1945. The U.S. Office of Censorship sent a confidential memo to newspaper editors and radio broadcasters asking that they give no publicity to balloon incidents, and this proved highly effective, with cooperation being described as excellent. But the deadliest incident was still coming. May 5, 1945, 3 months before Japan surrenders, 3 days before Germany's formal surrender ceremony in Europe, a beautiful spring day in southern Oregon. A 27-year-old minister drives his pregnant wife and 5 Sunday school students, ages 11 to 14, to Gerhardt Mountain in Fremont National Forest for a picnic. Ponderosa pines, bubbling creeks, perfect weather. He parks the car and begins unloading fishing rods and picnic baskets, while his wife, 5 months pregnant, walks with the children toward Leonard Creek. Minutes later, she calls out that they found something that looks like a balloon. He starts to shout a warning, but it's too late. Explosion. His wife dead, 5 children dead. The only combat-related deaths of civilians on the continental United States mainland during World War II, caused by a paper balloon launched 3 months earlier from a beach in Japan. Army investigators concluded the balloon had been lying undisturbed for approximately 1 month, and someone probably kicked the anti-personnel bomb or dropped it, triggering the detonation. But here's the bureaucratic nightmare. The tragedy happened during an absolute media blackout. Local newspapers reported that victims died in an explosion of undetermined origin. Families were told to remain silent. The military feared that revealing the truth would encourage Japan to launch more balloons. Over 450 people attended a mass funeral 5 days later, but media coverage mentioned nothing about balloons, Japan, or warfare. Finally, late May 1945, the military lifts the blackout and Western Defense Command issues warnings. But it's 1 month too late. The American response was massive, with over 2,000 military personnel participating in tracking, recovering, and studying balloon bombs. Operation Sunset coordinated radar and aircraft surveillance around the clock. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion deployed to Oregon and California for Operation Firefly, pioneering the concept of smoke jumper firefighting. Fighter pilots shot down balloons in mid-air ground crews, detonated recovered devices with explosives. Intelligence analysts catalogued every fragment. But the effectiveness statistics tell a brutal story. 9,300 balloons launched, approximately 1,000 estimated to cross the Pacific, 300 recovered or documented, 0 successful strategic fires, 1 fatal incident, 1 near miss at a nuclear facility, total American casualties, 6 civilians. From Japan's perspective, complete radio silence, 0 intelligence reports, no newspaper coverage, no confirmation that balloons were even reaching America. The censorship campaign worked perfectly, too perfectly. April 1945. Japan halts the Fugo program due to lack of evidence of success, depletion of kozo trees for paper production, destruction of hydrogen plants by B-29 raids, and the seasonal shift as jet stream winds weaken after March. The last balloon launched April 20th, 1945. The Fugo balloon bomb was the first weapon system in human history with true intercontinental range, predating the Soviet R-7 ICBM by 12 years. In 1944, while armies fought with tanks and rifles, while navies deployed battleships, while air forces dropped gravity bombs, Japan created an autonomous weapon that traveled 6,000 miles without guidance, without fuel, without human intervention. Just physics and patience. It was World War II's version of drone warfare. After the war, American scientists arrived in Tokyo in September 1945 to investigate Japanese war research, and what they found shocked them. The balloons were more sophisticated than anyone realized. The paper construction wasn't primitive, it was genius. Washi fiber tensile strength exceeded American predictions. The konnyaku paste remained flexible at sub-zero temperatures. The altitude control system demonstrated redundancy and fail-safes that contemporary American weapons lacked. The United States immediately classified all Fugo documentation and started their own balloon weapons program. The E-77 balloon bomb, developed in the 1950s, based on Fugo designs, was intended to disperse anti-crop biological agents, but operational deployment never happened. The WS-124A Flying Cloud program tested high-altitude balloons for delivering weapons of mass destruction, but was abandoned by 1956 as too inaccurate for nuclear warheads. But the real legacy wasn't military, it was meteorological. Wasaburo Oishi's research on the jet stream, published in Esperanto and ignored by Western scientists, proved absolutely correct with his calculations of wind speeds, altitude ranges, and seasonal patterns matching reality. American B-29 pilots flying bombing missions over Japan in late 1944 encountered something they couldn't explain. 125-knot tailwinds at 30,000 feet that scattered bombs before they hit targets. They called it unpredictable atmospheric phenomenon, but Oishi had documented it 20 years earlier. Post-war meteorology exploded as understanding jet streams became critical for commercial aviation, weather forecasting, and military operations. Modern trans-Pacific flights utilize the same westerly winds that carried Fugo balloons with aircraft routes following Oishi's maps almost exactly. March 10th, 1945. The Hanford power outage lasted 3 days. If that balloon had struck transmission lines just 100 yards differently, backup systems might have failed. If reactor cores had experienced thermal runaway, plutonium production could have halted for weeks or months. If the Manhattan Project timeline had slipped beyond August 1945, alternative invasion plans for Japan would have activated with estimated casualties of 1 to 4 million Allied personnel and 5 to 10 million Japanese civilians. One paper balloon, accidentally colliding with power lines, came that close to altering history. And the media blackout was so effective that Japan never learned their weapons succeeded. Intelligence officers interviewed after the war confirmed they discontinued Fugo because they assumed complete failure. If they had known about the Hanford incident, about balloons reaching Michigan and Texas, about American military resources deployed to track them, they might have continued launches through 1946. Oishi died in 1950, 5 years after the war ended, never knowing his research enabled the first intercontinental weapon system, never knowing his Esperanto publications, ignored by the world, changed warfare forever. To this day, balloon fragments appear in remote wilderness areas. 2014, British Columbia, 2019. British Columbia again. Unexploded ordnance from 1945, still functional, still dangerous. The Pacific Northwest warns hikers. If you find strange paper spheres or metal chandelier rings, do not touch them, do not move them. Some Fugo balloons are still out there 80 years later waiting. Modern researchers estimate several hundred balloons remain undiscovered, possibly thousands. They're in forests buried under decades of vegetation, slowly decomposing, but the explosives don't decompose. They just become more unstable. The National Air and Space Museum displays one intact Fugo balloon. The Canadian War Museum has another. Visitors stare at these delicate paper constructions and struggle to comprehend. This crossed an ocean. This carried bombs 6,000 miles. High school girls assembled this in a Tokyo theater. The Fugo balloon offensive failed strategically, but succeeded in ways Japan never intended and America never anticipated. It revealed vulnerabilities in continental defense that shaped Cold War military planning for decades. It proved intercontinental autonomous weapons were feasible with 1940s technology. It demonstrated that censorship campaigns could be so effective, they rendered successful attacks invisible to both sides. American intelligence knew about Fugo before the first balloon launched. Intercepted communications in October 1944 mentioned special atmospheric weapons, but analysts dismissed it as propaganda. Nobody believed Japan could successfully launch anything across the Pacific. When balloons actually appeared in November, it triggered brief panic about whether these were rangefinders for biological warfare or nuclear materials. The terror lasted for weeks, until technical analysis confirmed they were just paper hydrogen and conventional explosives. The Oregon tragedy almost didn't remain secret, as local newspapers initially refused the censorship request and the military had to personally visit editors. One editor later said they were told 6 dead now, or potentially thousands later if Japan learned their program worked. Perfect operational security created perfect failure. Japan discontinued a partially successful program because success remained invisible. America mobilized massive resources against a threat the public never knew existed. 6 people died in absolute silence, with their deaths classified for 3 months, while the war continued around them. Modern warfare inherited every lesson from Fugo. Autonomous weapons that operate beyond human control. Intercontinental range without traditional propulsion. Attacks that blend military and civilian targets. Defense systems that can't distinguish threats until impact. And the psychological dimension where if attacks remain secret, they may not even achieve their strategic purpose. Intercontinental ballistic missiles can now deliver nuclear warheads with precision Fugo never achieved. Cruise missiles navigate thousands of miles without pilots, just like balloons rode jet streams. Drones conduct warfare from continents away. Satellites surveil from space. And the distinction between strategic bombing and terrorism blurs when weapons choose their own targets through programmed physics rather than human guidance. The Fugo program cost Japan roughly 4 million yen total, about $10 million today, for 9,300 launches, approximately $1,100 per weapon delivered to enemy territory. Compare modern cruise missiles at $1 to $2 million each. Even adjusted for inflation, Fugo achieved intercontinental attack capability at a fraction of contemporary costs. Desperation accelerates innovation. Sometimes the simplest solutions work when complex ones fail. Environmental systems like jet streams can be weaponized by whoever understands them first. Secrecy cuts both ways, as perfect operational security can render victory indistinguishable from defeat. The last known Fugo incident wasn't in 1945. It was 2014 when Canadian Ordnance Disposal teams detonated a live balloon bomb in British Columbia 69 years after launch. The explosives were still functional. The hydrogen long since dissipated, but the paper envelope remained surprisingly intact. One technician noted that construction quality exceeded some modern equipment. WWII's Esperanto publications gather dust in meteorological archives, 1,246 pages of jet stream research that nobody read until after his discovery enabled intercontinental warfare. He wanted international scientific cooperation. He got weaponized atmospheric data. He died, never knowing his work changed military history. 6 people are buried in Oregon because high school girls in Tokyo pasted paper together with potato glue, because a meteorologist published in Esperanto, because B-25 bombers struck Tokyo in 1942, because warfare escalates in ways nobody predicts, because paper can cross oceans if you understand physics, because silence protects and condemns simultaneously, because the first intercontinental weapon was made from mulberry bark. The next time you fly trans-Pacific routes cruising at 35,000 feet at 500 miles per hour, you're riding the same jet stream that carried Fugo balloons, the same westerly winds Oishi documented in 1924, the same atmospheric rivers that almost changed World War II's outcome. Some Fugo balloons are still out there, buried, forgotten, slowly decomposing in Pacific Northwest forests. 80-year-old paper weapons waiting to be discovered, waiting to remind us that the most dangerous innovations often come from the most unexpected places. From schoolgirls and Esperanto speakers and engineers who refuse to accept that oceans are barriers when atmosphere flows freely above them. 9,300 paper balloons crossed the Pacific. 6 people died. 1 nuclear facility lost power. Infinite lessons remain unlearned, somewhere in a forest in Oregon or Washington or British Columbia. Another Fugo balloon still lies undiscovered, a paper weapon from 1945, still dangerous, still relevant, still teaching us that warfare's future was invented by its past.